Welcome to True Crime Mysteries, where we investigate cases that stumped investigators for years. Today, we're exploring a death in the woods that shook an entire generation to its core. What happens when the monster's parents fear aren't hiding under their children's beds, but sitting right beside them at the lunch table? Here's what happened. It was the summer of 1984. In a quiet suburban town on Long Island's North Shore, teenagers were doing what teenagers had always done. They gathered in the woods after dark, away from their parents, away from school, away from the rules that felt suffocating in the particular way only being 17 can make you feel. Northport, New York was the kind of town that appeared, on its surface, to be everything a family could want. Good schools, tree-lined streets, a harbor that sparkled on summer afternoons. The kind of place where people moved when they wanted to leave the noise of New York City behind and raise their children somewhere safe. But beneath that surface, something had been quietly unraveling. And on or about June 16, 1984, in a patch of woods the local teenagers called Aztakea, 17-year-old Gary Lauwers was killed. His body would not be found for weeks. And when investigators finally pieced together what had happened in those woods, the story they uncovered would be carried by newspapers across the country, debated in Congress, dissected on television, and whispered about in living rooms from coast to coast. It was a story about teenagers, about drugs, about the dark corners of adolescent subculture, and about a young man named Richard Kasso who had already earned himself a chilling nickname long before that night in the woods. They called him the Acid King. The story of what happened to Gary Lauwers in Aztakea Woods is one of the most disturbing cases in the history of Long Island, and arguably one of the most consequential true crime cases of the entire 1980s. Not because it involved a serial killer. Not because it remained unsolved for decades, but because of what it revealed, or what people believed it revealed, about a generation of American teenagers. It became a flashpoint, a symbol, evidence, for those who were already afraid that something had gone terribly wrong in suburban America. And at the center of all of it was a teenager from a good neighborhood who, by every account in the public record, had been slowly, visibly falling apart for years while the adults in his life struggled to know what to do. To understand what happened in those woods, you have to understand Northport. You have to understand the summer of 1984. And you have to understand Richard Kasso, the boy who was there before the Acid King ever existed. Northport is a village in Suffolk County, on the North Shore of Long Island. In 1984, it had a population of roughly 8,000 people. It was a harbor town with a charming downtown, a park that ran along the water, ice cream shops, boutiques, the kind of main street that photographers used when they wanted to illustrate the concept of American small-town life. The families who lived there were largely working class and middle class, many of them with roots in the trades, in small businesses, in the kind of steady employment that allowed you to own a house with a yard and send your kids to public school and feel, on balance, that things were going to be all right. And in many ways, things were all right. But the 1980s were a complicated decade for American youth culture, and Northport was not immune to those complications. Heavy metal music had exploded in popularity among teenagers across the country. Drug use was widespread in many suburban communities, and Northport was no exception. There was a group of teenagers in town, loosely affiliated, spending their evenings in Aztakea Woods or in the parks along the harbor, getting high, listening to music, drifting through their adolescent years with varying degrees of parental supervision. Some of them were kids who had slipped through the cracks of the systems designed to catch them. Some of them came from stable homes and simply made the choices teenagers sometimes make. And some of them, by 1984, had developed serious drug problems that were visible to anyone paying attention. Richard Kasso was born in 1966. He grew up in Northport. According to contemporaneous reporting by Newsday and the New York Times, as well as the detailed account later compiled by journalist David St. Clair in his 1987 book Say You Love Satan, Kasso had been a relatively normal child in his early years. He came from a family that was, by outward appearances, solidly middle class. His father was a well-regarded football coach at Northport High School. There were 4 children in the family. There was, on the surface, nothing that would have singled Richard Kasso out from any other kid in that town. But something shifted. The exact contours of that shift are complicated, and it would be irresponsible to reduce a human being's unraveling to a single cause or a single moment. What the public record does show is that by his early teenage years, Richard Kasso had become deeply involved with drugs. Marijuana at first, and then progressively harder substances, including LSD, which he used with a frequency and in quantities that alarmed those around him. According to reporting in Newsday in the summer of 1984, Kasso had developed a reputation in Northport as someone who could almost always be found with drugs, who used them constantly, and who had built his entire social identity around that role. The nickname, the Acid King, came from that reputation. It was not a name given in fear. In the context of that particular subculture, in that particular moment, it was closer to a badge of honor. His relationship with his family had deteriorated significantly by his mid-teens. According to the reporting that emerged after the summer of 1984, Kasso had at various points been effectively homeless, sleeping in parks, in Aztakea Woods, in the homes of friends and acquaintances. He had reportedly been arrested on multiple occasions for petty offenses, including grave robbing, a detail that reporters would later seize on as evidence of his alleged occult interests. He had been involved with the Suffolk County juvenile justice system. None of these interventions, according to the public record, had succeeded in altering the trajectory he was on. It's worth pausing here to acknowledge something important, because it matters to how we understand this case. The portrait of Richard Kasso that emerged in the summer of 1984 was shaped by an enormous amount of fear and media attention and a particular cultural moment that was not always conducive to nuance. The 1980s in America were the height of what historians and sociologists later termed the Satanic Panic, a period of widespread public anxiety about alleged satanic and occult activity, particularly as it related to teenagers and children. Heavy metal music was being blamed in congressional hearings for corrupting youth. Role-playing games were being investigated for supposedly encouraging occult thinking. There was a pervasive cultural fear, not entirely without basis in observable social changes, but often wildly exaggerated, that something dark and organized was infecting the minds of American teenagers. When the story of Richard Kasso broke in the summer of 1984, it landed directly into the middle of that fear. And the way the story was told, the emphasis on satanic ritual, on occult trappings, on the specific language allegedly used during the crime, reflected that cultural moment as much as it reflected the underlying facts. We'll return to that tension throughout this episode, because it matters. It matters for understanding what really happened in those woods, and it matters for understanding how this case came to mean what it meant to an entire generation of Americans. Now let's talk about Gary Lauwers, because in too many tellings of this story, Gary gets lost. He becomes a footnote in the story of Richard Kasso, which is a profound disservice to his memory and to the truth of what happened. Gary Lauwers was 17 years old in the summer of 1984. He lived in Northport. Like many of the teenagers in his social circle, he had been involved with drug use and the loosely organized gathering culture that centered around Aztakea Woods and the parks and streets of Northport. He was, by the accounts preserved in the public record, a young man who was navigating the same difficult terrain that many of his peers were navigating, with the added complications that came from that particular social world. He was somebody's son. He had people who loved him. He had a future that was taken from him. In the weeks and months before his death, Gary Lauwers and Richard Kasso had a conflict. According to multiple sources in the public record, including Newsday's 1984 reporting and the subsequent court proceedings, the conflict centered on drugs. Specifically, according to these accounts, Lauwers had allegedly taken mescaline from Kasso without paying for it. It was, in the context of that social world, a serious breach. Not in any legal or moral sense that would make sense to most adults, but within the internal logic of a subculture where drugs were currency and reputation was everything. Kasso was reportedly angry about it. By multiple accounts in the public record, he had made his anger known on more than one occasion. Here's what the public record establishes about the night of June 16, 1984. Richard Kasso, Gary Lauwers, and a third teenager named James Troiano were together in Aztakea Woods. They had been using drugs. At some point during that night, Gary Lauwers was killed. Richard Kasso was the person responsible for his death. That much was established beyond reasonable dispute by the investigation that followed. What was also alleged, and what would drive the national media coverage of this case, was the specific character of what happened in those woods. According to witness accounts reported by Newsday and the New York Times, and according to statements made by the Suffolk County District Attorney's office in 1984, the killing was accompanied by statements of a satanic or occult nature. The District Attorney's office described it publicly as a satanic murder. Those characterizations were, as we'll discuss, both significant and contested. What is certain is that Gary Lauwers was dead, and for the next several weeks, his body lay in Aztakea Woods, and almost no adult in Northport knew about it. This is one of the most disturbing aspects of this entire case, and it deserves to be understood in full. According to reporting by Newsday and the New York Times, in the weeks following the killing, knowledge of what had happened spread among some of the teenagers in Northport's drug-involved social circle. It is alleged in the public record that some number of young people knew, or had reason to know, that Gary Lauwers was dead in the woods, and that the information did not reach law enforcement for weeks. The exact number of people who had some knowledge, and the degree of that knowledge, was a matter of considerable dispute and investigation. But the basic fact that weeks passed between the killing and the discovery of the body is established in the public record. What does that tell us? It tells us something about the social dynamics of that particular group. It tells us something about fear, about loyalty, about the kinds of coercive social pressures that can operate within tight-knit subcultures. And it tells us something about the degree to which some of these teenagers had become isolated from the adult world in ways that made reaching out to law enforcement feel impossible or unthinkable. Whatever the reasons, Gary Lauwers lay in Aztakea Woods through June, into July, as the Long Island summer went on around him. Meanwhile, Richard Kasso was still in Northport. He was not hiding. According to contemporaneous reporting, he was seen around town, in the parks, in the places he had always been. There are accounts in the public record suggesting that he spoke about what had happened, that he may have shown some individuals the location of the body. The specifics of those accounts, and their accuracy, were matters explored in the subsequent legal proceedings. What is documented is that by early July, information about the killing had reached someone who reported it to law enforcement. The body of Gary Lauwers was discovered in Aztakea Woods and the case came to the attention of Suffolk County law enforcement. What followed moved with remarkable speed. On July 5, 1984, Richard Kasso was arrested. James Troiano was also arrested in connection with the killing. Both were charged. Kasso was charged with second-degree murder. Now, here is the moment that ensured this case would never be resolved in a courtroom, and that would leave a particular kind of unfinished quality hanging over it forever. 2 days after his arrest, on July 7, 1984, Richard Kasso died by suicide in his cell at the Suffolk County Jail. He was 17 years old. He had been held there for 48 hours. And with his death, the possibility of a trial, of cross-examination, of a public accounting of exactly what happened in Aztakea Woods, disappeared. Let that sit for a moment. The central figure in this case, the person who was charged with the killing, never stood trial. The full story of that night, as Richard Kasso understood it and experienced it, died with him. What we are left with is a picture assembled from witness accounts, from investigative reporting, from the proceedings of a separate trial for James Troiano, and from the cultural moment that surrounded and shaped the telling of this story from the very beginning. And at this point in our story, I want to pause and ask you something directly. As we work through the evidence and the accounts in this case, think about this. What do you believe happened in Aztakea Woods on the night of June 16, 1984? Was this a crime that was primarily about a drug dispute that turned fatal, amplified and transformed by the cultural lens of Satanic Panic? Or does the evidence suggest something more deliberate, more premeditated? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We go through every comment, and your perspective matters. Let's talk about what the investigation revealed, because the process by which law enforcement and the public came to understand this case is itself a crucial part of the story. The Suffolk County District Attorney's Office described the killing publicly as a satanic murder, a characterization that was immediately picked up by news organizations across the country. The New York Times reported on the case in July 1984, describing the alleged satanic elements of the crime. Newsday, the Long Island newspaper that was closest to the story geographically, produced extensive reporting on the case throughout the summer of 1984 and into the Troiano trial in 1985. National television news programs covered the story. The case became, almost overnight, a national news event. The specific elements that drove the Satanic Panic narrative were drawn from witness accounts and from the characterizations offered by law enforcement and reported by the press. These included descriptions of Kasso's interest in heavy metal music and occult imagery, descriptions of the alleged language used during the killing, and references to his earlier arrest in connection with grave robbing. Each of these elements, in isolation, might have been treated as the concerning but not necessarily extraordinary behavior of a deeply troubled teenager. In the context of 1984, in the context of the Satanic Panic, they were assembled into something that felt far more organized and sinister. It is worth noting, carefully and clearly, that the characterization of this case as a satanic ritual murder has been questioned by scholars and journalists who have examined it in the years since. The historian and sociologist Jeffrey Victor, in his work on the Satanic Panic, cited the Northport case as an example of how the framework of satanic ritual was applied to crimes that might more accurately be understood through the lens of drug-fueled violence, mental illness, and social isolation. This does not minimize what happened to Gary Lauwers. It does not excuse the person responsible, but it is an important corrective to a narrative that, in 1984, was being shaped by forces that had as much to do with cultural anxiety as with the specific facts of the case. What seems clear from the public record is this. Richard Kasso was a deeply troubled teenager with a serious drug problem, who existed within a subculture that had developed its own symbols, its own language, its own iconography drawn from heavy metal music and a loose, informal engagement with occult imagery. That subculture was one that many teenagers in the 1980s participated in to varying degrees, the vast majority of whom never committed any act of violence. The question of how much Kasso's interest in that imagery reflected genuine ideological commitment and how much it was adolescent posturing, the kind of dark-edged identity construction that troubled teenagers have always engaged in, is one that cannot be answered definitively from the public record. What is clear is that on or about June 16, 1984, a combination of factors including a drug dispute, a night in the woods, whatever substances were consumed, and whatever was happening in Richard Kasso's mind, produced a result that cost Gary Lauwers his life. Now let's turn to the legal proceedings, because the case did not end with Richard Kasso's death. James Troiano, the third person present in the woods that night, was also charged in connection with the killing. And his trial, which took place in Suffolk County in 1985, is the only formal legal proceeding that emerged from the death of Gary Lauwers. James Troiano's role in the events of that night was a matter of significant legal and public debate. He had been present in Aztakea Woods. He had been charged as a co-defendant. The prosecution argued, in its public statements and in the trial, that his presence and alleged participation made him criminally liable. The defense argued that the evidence did not support that conclusion. In 1985, James Troiano was tried in Suffolk County Court. The jury, after deliberation, returned a verdict of not guilty. Under the legal principles that form the foundation of the American justice system, James Troiano is presumed innocent, and the verdict of acquittal is the official legal determination of his culpability. Whatever one believes about the evidence, whatever interpretations one might apply to the accounts of that night, the court found that the prosecution had not met its burden of proof. That verdict stands. The Troiano acquittal was controversial at the time. Newsday's reporting from 1985 reflects a community that was deeply unsatisfied with an outcome in which only one person faced legal accountability, and that person had died before he could be tried. For the family of Gary Lauwers, for the people of Northport who had been shaken by this case, the acquittal felt, to many of them, like an absence of justice. Those feelings were understandable. They also existed in tension with the principles of a legal system that requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and that protects individuals from conviction in the absence of that proof. With the death of Richard Kasso and the acquittal of James Troiano, the legal chapter of this case effectively closed. Gary Lauwers' family was left without a trial, without a sentence, without any of the formal legal processes that are sometimes described, inadequately but genuinely, as closure. They were left with the knowledge of what had happened to their son and brother, and with a world that was already moving on, already turning their specific tragedy into a cultural symbol. Because that is exactly what happened. The story of Richard Kasso and Gary Lauwers did not stay in Northport. It traveled, and as it traveled, it transformed. And the transformation it underwent tells us as much about the United States in 1984 as it does about a specific night in Aztakea Woods. The timing of this case could not have been more significant from a cultural standpoint. In 1984, the Parents Music Resource Center, founded by Tipper Gore and other Washington spouses, was in the process of organizing what would become a nationally prominent campaign against explicit content in music, with heavy metal as a primary target. The PMRC would testify before the Senate Commerce Committee in 1985, and the Northport case was invoked in those discussions as an example of the alleged dangers of heavy metal music and the subcultures it spawned. Police departments across the country had begun forming units to investigate alleged satanic crime. Television programs were producing specials about the threat of Satanism in America. Books were being written. Seminars were being held for law enforcement officers. Into all of that walked the story of the Acid King of Northport. It was, for those who were already frightened, confirmation of everything they feared. A teenage boy from a respectable suburban family, killed in the woods by someone who called himself a Satanist, who used drugs constantly, who listened to the music that was already under scrutiny. The case was cited, discussed, and deployed in countless conversations about what was wrong with American youth. It was the kind of case that told a story people were already primed to hear. In 1987, journalist David St. Clair published Say You Love Satan, a book-length account of the case drawn from interviews and research. The book brought the story to an even wider audience and cemented the narrative of the Acid King in the popular imagination. It remains one of the primary narrative accounts of the case, though, like any journalistic reconstruction of events, it reflects the perspective and the limitations of its author and its era. The case also inspired fictional treatments. A 1994 independent film called Strangeland drew on the general cultural territory of the Northport case, as did various works of fiction and music. The specific imagery of the Acid King became part of the broader cultural mythology of the 1980s, a shorthand for a certain kind of suburban darkness. But here is the thing that gets lost when a case becomes a cultural symbol. The actual human beings at the center of it, the boy who was killed, his family, the community that had to live with the aftermath, they get flattened. They become figures in a story that is no longer primarily about them. And that is worth acknowledging, clearly and directly, before we go any further. Gary Lauwers was 17 years old. He had a family. He had people who loved him and who have had to live for decades with the loss of him, and also with the fact that his death became a media spectacle, a cultural symbol, a cautionary tale invoked by politicians and pundits and talk show hosts. There is a particular kind of secondary injury in that, a public dimension to private grief that the family of Gary Lauwers never asked for and never deserved. Richard Kasso was also 17 years old. That does not in any way mitigate the gravity of what he did. But it is a fact worth holding in mind. He was a deeply troubled teenager who had been struggling visibly for years, whose struggles had not been successfully addressed by any of the systems that encountered him, who died in a jail cell 2 days after his arrest, without ever having the opportunity to be evaluated, diagnosed, treated, or subjected to the kind of thorough forensic examination that might have provided a more complete understanding of what happened and why. His death, too, is a tragedy with dimensions that the cultural narrative surrounding the Acid King tends to obscure. And Northport itself, the community, suffered. The town became, almost overnight, the subject of intense national scrutiny. Reporters descended. Cameras arrived. The harbor that sparkled on summer afternoons was now the backdrop for news segments about Satan and teenagers and suburban decay. The people who lived there, who had built their lives there, who loved their town despite its flaws, found themselves living inside someone else's story about what their community was. Many of them pushed back. Many of them felt, with justification, that the coverage was more interested in confirming a predetermined narrative than in understanding the specific, complicated truth of what had happened. Now let's examine something that I think is genuinely important to understanding this case, and that raises a question I'd like you to think about as we move toward the conclusion of this story. And here is the question: is the Satanic Panic framing of the Kasso case an explanation, or is it an excuse? Think carefully about what I mean by that. The Satanic Panic was real. The way it shaped media coverage, prosecutorial decisions, and public understanding of cases across the country is documented and well established. The scholars and journalists who have argued that the satanic ritual framing of the Northport case was an overstatement are making a point that deserves serious consideration. It is almost certainly true that if this case had occurred 10 years earlier or 10 years later, outside the specific cultural context of 1984, it would have been understood primarily as a drug-related homicide committed by a deeply disturbed teenager, which is, in many ways, a more accurate characterization. But here is where it gets complicated. Acknowledging the role of cultural panic in shaping the narrative of this case does not mean the satanic elements were invented from whole cloth. The witness accounts, reported in Newsday and cited in court proceedings, described specific language and specific behavior during the killing that went beyond what you would typically associate with a drug-related altercation. The question is not whether those elements existed but how to weight them. Were they the central fact of what happened, as the 1984 narrative suggested? Or were they one component of a chaotic, drug-fueled act of violence committed by someone whose hold on reality had been severely compromised by chronic drug use and untreated mental health issues? The public record does not resolve that question with certainty. And because Richard Kasso died before trial, and because the only person who faced formal legal proceedings was acquitted, the factual record is permanently incomplete. We are left with a case that is more interpretive than evidentiary, more symbolic than resolved. And that, in some ways, is the most honest thing that can be said about the Acid King case. It is a case whose meaning has always been contested. It was contested in 1984, when some people in Northport felt the national media was exploiting their community's tragedy. It was contested in 1985, when the Troiano jury returned its verdict. It was contested in 1987, when David Street Clare's book offered one narrative and critics offered another. And it is contested today, when new generations encounter the story and bring their own frameworks to it. Let's talk about the legacy of this case, because it has one, and it is substantial. In the immediate term, the Northport killing accelerated conversations that were already happening about drug use among teenagers, about the influence of heavy metal music and subcultures associated with it, and about the alleged threat of satanic activity in American communities. These conversations produced some genuine policy responses and some panicked overreactions in roughly equal measure. Suburban police departments across the country added occult crime specialists. Parents groups pressured school districts to crack down on certain kinds of expression. The PMRC hearings, which occurred in September 1985, invoked the broader cultural territory of the Northport case in their arguments for music labeling. Whether any of these responses made teenagers safer is, at best, unclear. What is clear is that they reflected a genuine public anxiety that the Northport case had both confirmed and intensified. American parents in the mid-1980s were frightened about their children in ways that sometimes led to useful conversations and sometimes led to moral panic that made it harder, not easier, to address the real problems teenagers were facing. In the longer term, the Northport case became part of a broader reckoning with the Satanic Panic itself. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, researchers, journalists, and legal scholars had begun to systematically examine the claims made during the Satanic Panic and to find many of them wanting. The elaborate networks of satanic crime that had been alleged by some law enforcement officials and investigators were not supported by the evidence. The cases that had been presented as evidence of organized satanic activity were increasingly understood as isolated incidents shaped by cultural interpretation rather than coordinated occult conspiracy. The Northport case was examined in this light, and its place in the cultural narrative was revised accordingly. But revising the cultural narrative did not, and cannot, undo what happened to Gary Lauwers. It did not bring him back. It did not provide his family with justice or resolution. It did not change the fact that on or about June 16, 1984, in Aztakea Woods in Northport, New York, a 17-year-old boy was killed, and that the person responsible died in a jail cell 2 days after his arrest, and that the community, the family, and the culture were left to make what sense they could of something that, in its specific human reality, resisted the frameworks people kept trying to impose on it. There is another dimension of this case that deserves attention before we wrap up, and it is one that has become more prominent in the years since 1984 as understanding of adolescent mental health and addiction has deepened. And that is the question of what was not done, and perhaps what could not easily have been done, to address the crisis that Richard Kasso represented before the night in the woods. The public record documents a teenager who was visibly, publicly struggling for years. Who was known to local law enforcement. Who had been through the juvenile justice system. Who was known to be living, at times, without stable housing. Who had a drug dependency that was severe enough to define his entire social identity. By every measure that is now understood to be a warning sign, Richard Kasso was a teenager in serious crisis. In 1984, the resources available to address that kind of crisis in a suburban Long Island community were limited. The understanding of adolescent addiction and its relationship to mental health was far less developed than it is today. The stigma attached to seeking help for a teenager in crisis was significant. And the social world in which Kasso moved was one that was largely invisible to adults, operating in the parks and woods and late-night gathering places that teenagers have always used to create distance from the adult world. None of this is an excuse. None of it explains away what happened to Gary Lauwers or diminishes the responsibility of the person who killed him. But it does raise questions that are worth asking. What might have happened if more effective intervention had occurred earlier? What would have been required to reach a teenager like Richard Kasso in 1983 or 1982 or earlier? These are not questions with clean answers, but they are the kind of questions that, if communities ask them honestly, might actually save lives. They are also, frankly, the kind of questions that got less attention in the summer of 1984 than the satanic ritual narrative, precisely because the satanic narrative was more dramatic and more culturally legible than the quieter, more painful story of a troubled teenager who fell through every net that was supposed to catch him. Here's something else worth considering as we approach the end of this story. Northport is still there. Aztakea Woods is still there. The town has changed, as all towns change over 40 years, and it has made its peace, in various ways, with the events of that summer. The people who grew up there in 1984, who knew these individuals, who were part of that social world, are in their late 50s now. Some of them have spoken publicly about their experiences. Some of them have described the surreal quality of watching their specific, lived adolescence be transformed into a national morality play. Some of them have expressed anger at the coverage. Some have expressed a kind of complicated grief, not just for Gary Lauwers, but for the whole arc of it, for the way that summer ended something. One thing that has come through consistently in those accounts, in Newsday's follow-up reporting over the years, in various documentary treatments of the case, is that the real story of Northport in 1984 was more human and more heartbreaking than the Satanic Panic narrative allowed. It was a story about teenagers who were struggling, some of them badly, in a world that offered them more freedom than safety. It was a story about the limits of what parents could see, and the limits of what communities could address, and the particular kind of tragedy that results when those limits are exceeded by reality. Gary Lauwers deserved better. He deserved to grow up. He deserved to make it through whatever he was going through at 17 and to become whatever he might have become. He deserved a story that was about him, told with care and with attention to his specific humanity, rather than a story that used his death as a symbol of something else. This episode has tried, as much as possible, to keep that in mind. Let's take a moment to look at how this case has been assessed in the decades since it occurred, because the historical and scholarly assessment is genuinely interesting and genuinely illuminating. The Satanic Panic as a phenomenon has been extensively studied. Works by scholars including Jeffrey Victor, whose book Satanic Panic, The Creation of a Contemporary Legend was published in 1993, and by the sociologist Philip Jenkins, who examined the construction of moral panics around youth culture, provided frameworks for understanding how cases like the Northport killing were interpreted and why those interpretations took the form they did. These scholars argued, with considerable supporting evidence, that the satanic crime narrative of the 1980s was significantly constructed by cultural anxiety, by law enforcement officers who received training in supposed satanic crime indicators that were not empirically grounded, and by a media environment that was primed to produce and amplify stories that confirmed existing fears. Within that broader analytical framework, the Northport case is typically treated as an example of how genuine tragedy and real violence can be refracted through a distorting cultural lens into something that says more about the observers than about the observed. That is a persuasive argument, but it also has limits. It can become, if taken too far, a way of explaining away the specifics of what happened in favor of a meta-narrative about the Satanic Panic that is itself a kind of oversimplification. The truth, as best as it can be reconstructed from the public record, is that this case was both. It was a real crime. This video is for educational and entertainment purposes only. All information is sourced from public records, court documents, and published news. All persons are presumed innocent unless convicted by a court of law.